Hello, everyone. I'm Rita McGrath here, and welcome to another edition of our Thought Sparks podcast. And I could not be more thrilled than to have Ben Nelson here with me. Ben and I go all the way back to Wharton before his career as a successful entrepreneur, and now the founder of Minerva, which is a whole suite of programs with the intention of creating a whole new kind of university. So he's written a very dense book about building the intentional university, which is, it would be a lot of homework if it were assigned. So Ben, welcome. Great to see you again.
Great to see you, Rita. Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. So maybe just give our listeners a high-level overview. Who is this guy, Ben Nelson, who became a CEO at a ridiculously young age and has talked about having no peers, which is sort of wonderful and sort of sad at the same time.
Sure. I've had a very strange journey. As you mentioned, we met 30 years ago while I was working in this Wharton Small Business Development Center. And I was an undergraduate at the time.
And wasn't I was doing the Citibank project, as I recall. And we had the war room with all the posters. And
yes, that's right.
I was a PhD student at the time. And so one of the things you get to do as a PhD student is you get to actually manage some of the undergrads.
That's right.
That's how universities work, right?
That's right. And it was an interesting time because I now live in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and have been here for more than a quarter of a century. And when I talk about my first encounters with the commercial internet, which started in 1995, and I remember one of my clients at the SBDC were these twins who started an online store selling CDs. This was called CD Now. It predated Amazon. Amazon didn't exist yet, just to put that into some perspective. And it was this crazy thing because they were seeing their sales grow 60% per month over month. And every month they were losing more money. And they didn't understand what was happening. And it was just this crazy time to be introduced to the internet. I've really been around that world ever since. And as you mentioned, I first got a chance to become a CEO a few years later when I was 23. And today you say, oh, 23-year-old CEOs are a dime a dozen. Everybody graduates and starts their own company, et cetera. And at the time that was not a thing. And it was particularly not a thing because it wasn't a company I started. I was hired to be the CEO of this company, and it just taught me a lot. Taught me a lot on trial by fire, if you will, and to really understand what it means to bring a product or to create a product out of an idea, how to think through constraints, how to kind of manage the various constituencies, investors, board, founders, et cetera, employees, of course, in bringing an idea to life. And it also taught me that being a CEO is a lonely job, very, very lonely job. And so when my early 20s, where I decided it may not be the best career choice for me, I didn't think I was really built for it. So when I ran my next company at 29, it was a bit of a surprise. I didn't expect to be in that position again. But ever since, I kind of understood that was what I was probably built for, and I've been running organizations ever since, in the last 20 years plus. And so that's been a really wonderful opportunity to make some real change and impact. And over the last 15 years or so, to really focus on bringing this my own idea into fruition, which has been obviously very gratifying.
Indeed. And I have this theory about the kinds of organizations we're moving into, and I suspect this is likely to be how you to corral the cats at Minerva, that today's CEOs, they're very involved. They're not top down, but the better ones anyway.
Right.
Thinking like Brian Chesky at Airbnb. But they're very involved with this group of 30 to 40 people, but they spend a lot of time together. And so what ends up happening is you have this kind of common mind melt that seems to be emerging. Just as I'm thinking about what leadership and management look like as we move into much more digital organizations.
Yeah, but my evolution certainly as a CEO has been dramatic. When I was in my second stint as CEO, when I was 23, there's not much to learn from. I was just learning, I was figuring out what to do. But when I was running Snapfish at 29, I was very much a top down, here are the marching orders, here's what will happen from today, this week, this month, etc. And it was an interesting lesson because in the current time, it was highly effective. We grew 20x in size in 5 years, went from 127th entrant to the market to global number one by a factor of 5x in a decade. Had a really remarkable level of success. And at the same time, when it came time for me to pursue my next thing, when I wanted to do something different of my own, I was thinking about, and I did an 18-month transition plan, and I thought laid all of the groundwork for success. The reality is that after I left, the organization didn't continue to grow, didn't continue to have that. And it's easy to say, oh, I did everything right, and then the people who came after me did everything wrong. It's actually, I think, exactly the opposite. I didn't do my job well because I didn't build the institutional capacity to actually survive without this micromanagement, top down, do everything as you were supposed to do. And so when I built Minerva, and I wanted to make sure that was not going to be the case, and I had a little interim executive chairmanship, which I got to exercise some of those less top-down types of approaches. I really wanted to make sure that there is a whole organization alignment, and that decisions really were done from the bottom up. And I remember very, very early on, I hired my first executive, who was my chief product officer, and he was hiring a team. And we were only 5 people at the company at the time. And he was interviewing somebody, and he asked me, of course, to interview the person. And I hated him. I thought he was terrible. And he said, what did you think? And I said, listen, if I had a vote, I would say no for these reasons. And he says, well, what do you mean if you had a vote? You're the founder and CEO. You started the company. There are only 5 of us. Of course you have a vote. I said, no, I don't have a vote. You have things that you need to deliver. We agreed on what those things are. I can't both tell you who to hire, what to do in order for you to deliver them and hold you accountable. You have to actually understand that. Now, I think this person is a bad fit, but if you think he's the right fit, you go ahead and hire him. And what was interesting about it was they actually did make him an offer, or we made him an offer, but he didn't take it. So we never know which one of our instincts were right, but in some ways it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you enable, even at that very early stage, that you enable and trust that you built a team that will make calls that are fundamentally better than yours. And it doesn't mean that you don't push, doesn't mean you don't give your opinion. It doesn't mean that sometimes you don't create mandates and steer the organization in ways in which it needs to be steered. But it does have that kind of balance where not every decision can be or should be made in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm seeing that a lot, that the whole premise of decision making is sort of that the person who's most directly affected by the decision is the ultimate decider, but then what they have to do is socialize that decision with the other stakeholders that are affected. I'm seeing that model emerge a lot in these more modern organizations that I'm studying. So let's talk about education. You and I were talking about my own beloved institution and many of the others, and maybe start off with just your critique of education. So for those just joining us, I'm here with Ben Nelson, CEO and founder of Minerva, co-author of this book. And the Minerva Project is now, 15 years in now, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
So you're validating a lot of those initial assumptions, which is terrific.
Oh, very much so. Look, my critique of education really centers on first and foremost what I view as its central role in society. And on the one hand, I personally believe that universities are the single most important institutions on the planet. They are the determinants of who is going to make decisions for humanity. Practically every single person who makes decisions of consequence, decisions that affect the lives of others more than they affect the lives of themselves, has gone through the filter of universities. And so that puts them in an absolutely critical role in society. On the other hand, I believe, and I believe that the evidence is incontrovertible, it's not really a belief, that universities are the least effective institutions in society when it comes to education. And so that dichotomy creates a very, very significant problem for the world. And why is it that I say that universities are ineffective institutions? When I give talks, I oftentimes ask two questions of the audience. And for those listening, I'll ask you the same question. So question number one is, imagine spontaneously, right now, I were to conjure up a final exam from your undergraduate days, and assuming you didn't just take your undergraduate exam yesterday or a week ago, and I would have put on the timer and say, go. And no matter if you got an A on the final exam as an undergraduate, and assuming you are not a professor of that subject today, are you able to get anything above an F right now? And overwhelmingly, the response is no. Of course, I didn't actually retain any of that information. And so that's kind of one broadly accepted reality, that much of what we've done as undergraduates from a formal educational perspective, forget what you learn as being, in a campus environment and having fun with friends and growing up, et cetera. Just imagine on the courses, the things that technically you're paying tuition for. A lot of it is cram, pass, forget. But there's a second question I ask, which I think is in some ways more profound, which is, imagine that you don't just have one final exam. Imagine you have every exam, every paper, everything you've ever done in undergraduate. And today, you could get an A in all of them. You know all the material. In what way would your life be different? And practically nobody can give an answer to that question. And that, in many ways, is the fundamental flaw of our educational system. And by the way, it is not because the material in those courses is not relevant. In many cases, it's highly relevant. The problem is nobody can articulate why it's relevant. And that's really the purpose of education. The purpose of education is not to just know certain things. It is to know what to do with them, how to apply them. The answer should be crystal clear. It should be, well, if I knew all of this material, if I was able to get an A on every test, on every assignment, if I was able to execute at that level, I'd be a vastly better decision maker. I'd be a vastly better critical thinker. I'd be a vastly better communicator. I'd be a vastly better individual that understood how the solutions and systems of the world actually function. But that's not what universities teach you to do. And the reason isn't because they're assigning the wrong books or they're assigning the wrong texts or the subject matter is wrong. It's because they don't surface those metacognitive tools. They don't actually teach as their primary reason for existence those methodologies to understand and apply systems thinking to whatever subject matter area, context, problem that you are facing. And if universities were to reorient to actually focus on those metacognitive tools, on systems thinking, and use subject matter to illustrate, then the answer would be obvious. And that's really what we've been able to demonstrate at Minerva. The university and I started at Minerva University, graduates of the institution every day use what they've learned as undergraduates and do so explicitly. They don't just say, "Oh, I had a great time." They say, "Oh, what this particular tool I just used an hour ago. This other tool I used yesterday." And it's because the education is one that is explicit about what it is that we're doing, and it's structured in such a way that they learn it in a method that makes it generalizable, that allows them to be able to apply it no matter what it is that they encounter. And so that was my fundamental critique of the institution, that they're simply not going about having a pedagogical, curricular, and assessment framework that enables authentic learning. And every ill that comes out of the university, from the cost overruns to the collapsing of standards to great inflation to kind of nonsense that shows up in class and people being taught things that are empirically false, but that some professor believes and therefore they teach them as fact. All of those problems are just symptoms of that core rot.
Fascinating. So there are some folks that have a theory that in many ways our education systems were designed, really for a different era, and that a lot of their primary function was to sort of sort people into social classes, right? And that you honestly didn't want your lower level employees, let me call them, the people that are working with their hands and working on assembly lines. You almost didn't want them educated because they get bored. And I even heard one theory floated, which is that one of the reasons that in Germany they imported so many workers from places like Turkey was that the Germans who'd been through the German educational system weren't willing to work on the assembly line. So it's a very interesting theory, right? If you think about sort of capitalist control of these big institutions. I think that's very true. I also think a lot of our institutions are, they're purpose built for a different time, and we're moving into a very different era at the moment. So maybe give some examples of how do the students learn at Minerva? What do you do to keep the standards high? I mean, the scuttlebutt is it's much harder to get a high GPA at Minerva than it is at a lot of our other esteemed institutions. It's you kind of have no place to hide, and you got to do the work.
Exactly right. Yeah, look, that really is the ultimate benefit of being able to reimagine something from scratch. If you think about the way that a traditional institution is structured, the educational process is atomized. You take a course with a professor. That professor broadly determines everything about that course.
Mm-hmm.
The syllabus, what's being taught, how much the syllabus has actually gone through. I don't know how many university classes I went through where the entire syllabus was covered. That almost never happened. When we got through 2/3, we declared victory, and because things were constantly slipping, and it's like, we don't have time, so we'll cram that in the last 2 sessions. The grading policies. I remember I had one course where the cutoff for an A was 34%. So because just nobody learned anything. So you had this crazy curve to be able to actually have some people that had A's and others. And it's completely disconnected. And so almost every 102 level course that I took as an undergraduate, the first month we repeated the entire 101 level because the professor assumed we didn't learn it. Which was true. Of course, we didn't learn anything in the 102 either. And so the pattern just continued in these siloed 4-month experiences. So the first thing that we did was we broke that concept altogether, that the curriculum was structured centrally. And the process of going through from one class to another meant that not just in every class, but in every session, the process of what happened in the lesson was timed. such that you are going through and understanding the material. It relied on students learning a great deal outside of the classroom setting. It's flipped classroom, which is relatively straightforward as a best practice. You consume the information outside of class, you exercise it outside of class, and then you do original application, especially in those areas that are not black and white, exploring the black and the gray. What is certainly wrong versus what could potentially be correct. And having engaged social learning and taking advantage of social learning, having a group of peers and an expert in leading the discussion that are able to navigate and solidify the concept in multiple contexts. And so the coherence and assurance that comes from having a centrally designed curriculum was crucial. The second element is pedagogically, we wanted to make sure that the students are actually doing deep processing. They're actually using and making associations. The two core maxims, there are 16 underlying components in that book that you showed in the little dense approach that we used in our philosophy, building the intentional university, and such that the activities in the classroom were such that the students were actually learning. They were actually absorbing information in a way that years later they can recall it, that they can go back and actually leverage what it is that they have learned. And that was really, really important, to create the infrastructure and to enable the professor to ensure that the students are learning. And that was a huge part of it. And the last is the assessment framework. And in aligning the incentive of the student with authentic learning, which basically means that we measure how broadly and consistently effectively a student has been able to apply what they've learned, as opposed to just say, oh, I know the definition, or oh, I recall the particular fact or figure. It is all about breadth of application, right? And therefore understanding how a student can apply what they've learned when prompted or unprompted, spontaneously versus deliberatively, when they produce work versus when they critique others' work, across subject areas, across culture, across different modalities of learning. And so those, or application. And so that is the fundamental change in the approach. Now, when you have that structure, you can also reimagine the institution. And so in our context, when we built Minerva University, the students come and live together. It's obviously a social residential university, but their classes are conducted in a digital learning environment that is optimized for learning. So small seminars, professors, less than 20 students per class, engaged in that black and gray conversation in a structured way, highly assessed every day. There's accessible material where the student is getting feedback. But in their day-to-day life, they're living in different contexts. So they start in San Francisco, and the way I designed the university, they would then live in 6 other countries over the following 3 years, applying what they've learned, not just from course to course, from subject to subject, but from culture to culture, and see how different the real world treats certain analytical frameworks. And so that was a core element of getting that richness of learning.
And when you talk about assessments, is this something that they do to each other? Do the professors assess them? Does the computer do that? How do you measure that?
Yeah, so historically it was professor assessment alone. And now when you have artificial intelligence as well, it's professors and AI conducting some of the assessments. And we're, of course, training it to conduct more and more, not to actually replace the work of the professor, but to assess more things. Imagine a scenario where everything you say in class gets assessed, everything, where every element of an assignment gets assessed, right? That's not something a human being possibly can do. You know, if a professor teaches 60 students over the course of a semester, they cannot give that kind of granular feedback to all 60 students. If you were to rely on TAs to do that, which is in many ways, teaching assistants, in many ways, what many large universities do, they miss a lot of things. They don't also, sometimes they have a significant load of grading, etc. AI can supplement some of the human graded elements and can actually learn from the professor on how it is that they're assessing certain things and amplify that.
That's amazing. And so does that result in a grade?
So that's actually another interesting thing in our design. In a Minerva program, the professors assess, but the institution grades. And that's what's so interesting, right? If you were to go to really any university in the country and say, I have a B plus in a certain class, that B plus contains zero usable information. A B plus in physics 235 is radically different than a B plus in history 235. There's really no connection between them. In Minerva programs, the various levels of grades are set by the institution, and therefore a certain quantum of assessments using rubrics across a certain number of learning objectives, across a certain set of contextual applications, will generate a certain level of grade. And that means that your history and physics class use the same rubric, and your ability to demonstrate broad application of those tools will determine your grade at a particular level of class. And that creates a coherence to what it is that you've been actually learning, and an incentive structure that ensures that the student is learning. That the idea that you can say, oh, I had 36% correct, that's an A, because the rest of my class knew even less. That's not the right measure, right? You haven't actually learned anything. Mm-hmm. Right. And so what you actually need to do is to hold firm and say, no. It is our responsibility as an institution to ensure that the materials that we present are pedagogically sound, meaning that the student has the opportunity, if they put in the effort, to actually learn, to actually be able to master this material. And it is the student's responsibility to put in the effort to do so. There's nowhere to hide in that kind of process. And what instead we do is, one of our former colleagues, or my former mentor, your former colleagues at Penn, Jamshed Gandhi, used to tell me that there's a devil's bargain between professor and student at universities, which is that the less work they both do, the happier they both are.
Well, and now we should add AI into the mix, right? So you've got the students using AI to grade the papers, and the professors are using AI to grade the papers. And it's like, why are we even here?
Exactly right. And so that is the structure that needs to be avoided, right? Because in that case, nobody learns, mm-hmm. right? And that's the key, right? That if we design a process correctly, we use AI to leverage and actually amplify learning as opposed to reduce the load.
Yeah, well, I think AI has some really interesting potential. I mean, it doesn't get bored, doesn't need to go to the bathroom, it doesn't call in sick, and it's sort of can be infinitely patient. And I think for certain learning styles, that's so valuable. And I imagine you guys were playing around with AI long before we knew what a chat GPT was.
Without question. In fact, when I founded Minerva in 2010, I mistakenly assumed that broad-based use of AI would be commercially around in 2 or 3 years. And so the entire curricular arc at Minerva was to build on a post-AI type world. And in my kind of bastardized version of AI, you first encountered AI in the sense that there was no need for learning black and white in a classroom, because basically the AI would teach you that, right? You would just be able to one-on-one understand what is true, what is not true. It would surface the core ideas that you need to know, and you would be tooled coming into a classroom with all of the basics that you needed to, because you would have practiced it correctly. And then the things you had to learn were things that the AI really couldn't do for you. And ultimately, what does that mean? It means to make decisions. AI can provide you with answers, right? But we don't want AI to make the decision based on those answers. And in fact, when we do, we find that the decisions are pretty deleterious, right? I mean, our first encounter with AI on a broad basis happened well before ChatGPT. It was with social media algorithms.
Yes, that's a great point.
And that didn't turn out so good.
No.
And it is not doing so good because the AI was trained on one thing, which was maximize profit for the corporation.
Well, maximize engagement, which often means maximizing truly horrible stuff.
Exactly. And the collateral damage was not a decision that a human being would make, or certainly not an educated human being, one that has a what I refer to as a real education, a Minerva type of education. And the problem is that if we are not trained to have higher order thinking than the AI does, then we are going to be in a true collapse of society. And so that becomes the imperative of a university. And if people think that reading Shakespeare is sufficient to get somebody to that point, they are dead wrong. Because we've seen the outcome of that. It's not sufficient, right? You cannot enable the student to abstract and hope that they're going to have that higher order of consciousness that is going to be able to get them to deal with really what is a vastly superior answer production machine than the human being is. The AI will be able to get you sufficiently good answers on the surface. What it won't do is think about the various complexities and understand the various complexities and nuances that a human being is going to have to make and live with the decision that they're going to make. And decision isn't just for our, governing officials and CEOs, et cetera. It's for the voter. It's for the line worker. It's for the person that is going to have any kind of impact, any kind of second or third order effect on the work that they do. And so the nature of the curriculum, the nature of what must be learned when it comes to our modern world is radically different. And the structure of what it is that we're learning is equipped for approximately the 11th century. So, right, I mean, it is, the university is still fundamentally on the modality of a pre-printing press world. Forget pre-internet, right? The structure of the university was introduced hundreds of years before the printing press and has not changed. And that's the fundamental difference, right? That the idea that the university is there to create and disseminate knowledge is simply incorrect, right? There is an element of knowledge creation, sure, but the university is not there to disseminate the knowledge that it created. The knowledge that it creates is massively esoteric, right? And should be disseminated at the PhD level, maybe at some small variance in the graduate level. But overwhelmingly, the information that the university needs to give students the ability to interrogate, which is its real mission, to interrogate, not disseminate information, right, is information that is produced by others, historically, by other institutions, etc. And so the real job of an institution is to teach its students to be wise, to know how to apply what it is that they learn in situations they've never encountered before, and do so in an explicable way, right? To actually teach students to be wise systematically, so that they can say, I am deciding this versus that for these reasons, as opposed to just saying, well, I think that's the right thing. I can't tell you why, which is probably how naturally formed wisdom shows up, as rare as it is.
Mhm.
And so that's the shift, that's the reform that we're trying to implement through Minerva programs.
And you, the application, this is mostly project based, as I understand it.
It's framework based,
Mhm.
but it does a lot of project work to illustrate. And I think this is a really important difference. In a lot of project based education that is done in K-12, oftentimes a little bit in higher ed, it is indeed project based. You learn some things, and then you say, now go build a bike, and then see what works and what doesn't. And the problem when you base things in projects is that you don't really know whether or not the thing that you did makes sense.
Mhm.
Right? You say, oh, I built a bike and I got on it and I rode around the parking lot and it worked. So great, I now know how to build a bike. But what happens if that bike hit a pothole? What happens if you ride it not for 5 minutes but for 10 hours? Right? What happens if you wear different kinds of clothing when you ride it? What happens if the weather changes? Right? The idea of thinking through and interrogating frameworks rather than learning from the outcome of a project is really crucial. And the reason for that is that the first law of decision science is that you never judge the quality of a decision by its outcome.
Yes, agree.
The decision must stand on its own rational framework. And it could be that something had a 92% chance of success, but the outcome was in one of the 8% failure, or vice
You're,
versa.
you're a travel company and it's December of 2019.
Correct. Exactly right.
I'm going to rush in and come to your rescue at that point.
Exactly right. And so that means that, you don't want to make decisions on an N of one,
Mhm.
right? And this is in some ways what's kind of interesting about a lot of the methodologies that we use in teaching is that even, the more sophisticated, the case method, the case method is kind of an interesting set of applications, but unless you look at cases as, looking at the same tools across 50 different cases, now you have an N of 50 and you see the same approaches and you say, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. It worked here, it didn't work there. I make the connections, etc. The case method is just ends of one. The learnings may or may not be applicable,
Mm-hmm.
right? And therefore, so from our perspective, our assumptions are you want to base your learning on frameworks. So
Mm-hmm.
not on content, old school, not on projects, the technically newer school, but on frameworks. And you use content to support and illustrate the frameworks, and you use applications, projects, assignments, etc., real world interactions in order to apply and assess those frameworks.
Super interesting. Well, one of my big beefs with the case method is that most cases have to be approved by the company that they're about.
Right.
So you're never going to get the real story of how that thing went down. One of my all-time favorites is the story of Blockbuster. And there's this mythology, oh, Blockbuster, missed the internet, blah, blah, blah. That's not true. What happened was a turnaround guy, apparently a very talented executive called John Antioco, realized that two things were happening. Late fees were driving customers crazy, and that the internet was on its way, and that he needed to prepare for both of those things. And to do that was going to cost $400 million to get rid of the late fees and prepare for the internet. And his parent company, Viacom at the time, didn't like that idea. So they floated the company on an IPO at a vastly depressed price because of this cost overhang. And I think he just had the timing wrong. So an activist investor by the name of Carl Icahn says, oh, yum, I can get this thing to the song. He buys it. Eventually, he manages to ease Antioco out, hires this other guy called Jim Keys, I believe his name was, who said, we're back to late fees, and this internet thing, I don't think that's going to really make any difference. And that is what actually happened. Yeah. So, where in class do your students learn about skullduggery, corporate politics, and all that kind of thing, right?
Absolutely. No, that's such a great lesson, right? And you're exactly right. The case methodology has to be approved, right? And this is why frameworks are so crucial. I remember when we first did our an experiment to put our educational model at another in another institution. There was we put in a couple of our courses that we taught our students at that other institution, and then they took their other classes with their traditional university. And I asked them at the end of the first year, I said, hey, just curious, do your other professors that teach you the other classes, they know that you're in the Minerva program? There are only 20 of them out of a first incoming class of 2,000. They said, oh yeah, everybody knows. And I said, well, that's interesting. So why do they know? And they said, well, it's very simple, because we're the only students that sit in the front row of the class. We're the only students that ask questions, and we're the only students that point out the logical fallacies of our professor. And it was the beauty of frameworks-based applications, right? Which is that if you have the right frameworks, you can use a case and look at it and say, oh, what is the bias that's clearly displayed in this case? How do I look at other source material, and see the slightly skewed presentation of this data, compared to reality, etc. And so that is, again, it just demonstrates that even if you have certain tools that you're using now, as biased or whatever it is that they are, if you have the appropriate education, if you have the right frameworks that you can deploy, then you indeed can have a significantly better outcome.
And I would say one of the things I value about my PhD training was, and not so much my undergraduate training, which was more humanities, but certainly in the PhD program, one of the things they beat into you is, what are your boundary conditions? And certain things will work within that set of boundary conditions, and then if the boundary conditions change, you need another set of things. So you're now at a stage where you've got a fair number of graduates, right? You've got a few thousand now, right?
1,000 graduates of our own program, and beginning to graduate our partner programs, because it took us a while to build them and get them out the door.
Well, and you got to debug anything new. I mean, there are going to be assumptions to make that, we thought that was going to work and it just never does. That always happens when you're doing a startup. But your plan is to grow Minerva, as I understand, and you've got a big grant from Reed Hastings, and you've got, your goal isn't just to start with Minerva, it's to really change the way that we educate our young, right? And maybe the way we educate all during our lives, because I believe that we're going to have some way of thinking about continuous education. I had a great conversation with my friend Herminia Ibarra, who works at London Business School.
Yes.
She said, if somebody takes 2 years off and somebody says, well, what did you do in that 2 years? And you say, oh, I did an MBA. That's fine. Everybody understands what that is. But if you're 53 and you take 2 years off and people say, what did you do with that 2 years? We don't have an equivalent, place to put people. So I think we're going to have to invent that as well.
Absolutely. And Herminia, by the way, is a good friend and somebody who was also around in the early days of the Minerva program. Got quite a bit of thoughts and advice from her. So I consider her to be a great person in the space. And yes, the fundamental rethinking and the scaling of the Minerva model isn't just in, of course, scaling and having more students go through Minerva University. It is through building other university programs using the Minerva philosophy at other institutions. We now work with universities in 8 different countries to offer Minerva design programs, which are expanding rapidly. We're also doing professional executive education through a number of partners. We're built a high school curriculum. We created a new company that we've spun out. One of the reasons my title here is founder and CEO of Minerva is because I founded Minerva University, Minerva Project, now the Minerva Baccalaureate, which is our high school program. And this morning, I was just working on our very first middle school program. And so we want to make sure that we're really bringing this kind of education on a much broader basis. Even though there are only about 600 students at Minerva University today, there are 30,000 students that are in a Minerva program in one form or another across the world. And so that's really the goal for us, is to expand that reach as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And what you've got partnerships. I trust that you've got new allies, new partners as you try to grow the program.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Minerva, the constellation of Minerva partnerships, is in some ways a motley crew of institutions. You have really, kind of flagship, prestigious institutions like UC Berkeley and University of Tokyo and USC, et cetera, to private institutions, for-profit, non-profit, comprehensive, narrow, small, large, and that arc only has one common definition, which is leadership that is committed to the learning of students in authentic ways. Mm-hmm. The only thing that unifies all of our partners are extraordinary forward-thinking leaders that are just not okay with the status quo. Mm-hmm. And that's why our partner base looks as it does, because it is merely a reflection of the leadership. And our hope is that over time, the partner base will actually come to be the marker of institutions that actually care about student learning versus the marker of institutions that just want to issue diplomas and collect money. And we want to be able to expose the difference between those two. And the difference will be clear. It will be clear because the quality of the graduates of those institutions will be markedly different. And the university is going to have a choice. They're going to have a choice, which is to say, I don't want to have a conversation with my faculty. I want to let them do whatever they want. I want to hide in the corner and pretend like I'm teaching my students. Or I'm going to have a conversation with my faculty. I'm going to inspire them to commit to education as can be done only by the collective, as opposed to by the individual. And I'm going to rally them to the mission of the institution, which is to nurture critical wisdom, as we adopt our mission, for the sake of the world, not for the sake of the student getting a job, not for the sake of the student donating money back to the institution because they have a great time and they sat down and were entertained by a professor that happened to be funny, but because these students are going to be making decisions that will affect hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of other human beings. And we have a responsibility to make sure that they're making those decisions effectively. And if you engage the faculty in that kind of conversation, if you engage them in the criticality of fulfilling the mission of the university, I want to see the faculty member that says, no, I really like my massively ineffective lecture. I really don't care. Leave me alone. I want to have that conversation and call that person.
There's a fair number of faculty members for whom your proposal does not sound like the kind of life they signed up for.
Oh, it's very much not. It's very much not. But that is largely because I don't think they realized what life they did sign up for. Right? The faculty members at writ large have decided to take up a life of service without understanding that it is a life of service.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fair criticism. Absolutely. And I think I've hung around higher ed a long, long time. The incentive systems are really antithetical to what you're talking
about. Correct. They're exactly. And many faculty, sadly, who did sign up for a life of service, who did in the early part of their journey say, I really want to be an educator. I want to impact students' lives, go into a system which doesn't incentivize them to do that.
No,
and some do so despite the system, despite the incentive, and others have succumbed to it. Right? And this is why we need reform. because we actually have to reform the state of our higher education institutions and secondary education institutions to do those things. And what happens is, and I remember when I was starting Minerva, we had a big splash of press. And I remember one of the very first interviews that I did, we raised a lot of money. We had Larry Summers, who was the chair of our advisory board. So we had,
It's so smart the way that you did that, and you do describe that in the book, that you realize starting a whole new university, it's kind of one of those chicken and egg situations. You have to have an excellent program, and you
Correct.
were public about saying we're going to be the best university in the world, which I thought was, that had a certain amount of grit to it, right? But then how do you convince people that that's true? And then how do you get the right kinds of students to turn up?
Yeah, exactly. And so we had to solve all of those chicken and egg problems. And a big part of that was the way that we publicly positioned, right? And so convincing our funders was very, very difficult. Interestingly, convincing Larry was not. It was very clear to him the flaws of the current system. He's spoke publicly about those flaws many times. And when he saw the solution that I was proposing, he understood, oh, this addresses them. It looks at all of the problems in higher education and addresses them in one package. And what was important for me in the very early days, and I was mentioning, got this flood of press that I had one reporter, I think, in the very first day of press that we got, who was interviewing me. She was a reporter in a Silicon Valley, blog that was well read, and she says, "Oh, you're disrupting higher education." I said, "No, I'm not disrupting higher education. I'm reforming higher education. Disruptors suggest that the institutions need to be burned to the ground, and new institutions need to be built on top instead of them. What I am saying is that higher education institutions, as I said at the very beginning, are the most important institutions in society, and therefore they need to be reformed, right? They're ineffective, which means that they must be reformed, because if they're not reformed, they will be disrupted, and they will be disrupted by nefarious forces."
Possibly.
And that is to me the core mission of what we're doing, the challenge of what we're doing, which is that if we do not reform these institutions, it's not that other institutions, I think, that will rise up that will nurture critical wisdom. What other institutions will do, as what some quote unquote reformed higher education institutions do now, which are formed in the wrong way, is to say, well, the student doesn't learn anything anyway. Why pay so much money? Why spend 4 years? Why do all of these things? Let's just, hand out diplomas for anybody who will pay, right? Let's become diploma mills. And you see traditional universities that have just become diploma mills, right? They say, "Oh, we'll take anybody, we'll graduate everyone," right? And by the way, people think about diplomas. I talk about this one university that had a really terrible outcome or outcomes. Only 14% of the grades that they issued were A's, and they worked very, very hard at it. And over 6 decades, they brought that to 81% success, right? 81% of the grades they were given were A's. And so they were just really, really happy with that progress. And that institution's name was Yale. That's the answer. Yale is a diploma mill. I mean, it's a hard thing to face in the reaction, but it is a fact. It is merely a fact that you cannot flunk out of an Ivy League university. It's impossible. And you can decide to drop out, right? But you have to, the attempts that you need to do to not get good grades at Ivy League institutions are Herculean. And that was not the case in the past. And so we are following these processes where the cheapening of the degree, the rot in the institution, is causing external forces to come in and say, this is not good. And we need to teach these institutions a lesson. And guess what happens when certain forces do that? The public kind of looks and says, yeah, I mean, maybe they shouldn't be taught lessons in that way, but they definitely need to learn a lesson, right? They definitely are not teaching the right things. They're definitely not producing graduates that are, that employers are thrilled with. The litany of complaints is myriad.
Mhm.
And unless the institutions reform, they will be disrupted. And I think that is a very dangerous world. It's also very dangerous to look at the disruptors and say, oh, yes, let me salute and do what it is that you want me to do, because that's not the right approach. The right approach is to be unimpeachable. It is to do the kinds of things for and with your students that nobody from the outside can look at and say, no, that should not be done. I one of my more proud moments was after I founded Minerva during the Obama administration, and folks like Ted Mitchell and others in the Department of Education under Obama were big fans and promoting Minerva and all the rest, that Betsy DeVos in the Trump administration came to visit us and was a huge fan. And for me, that is the point of the institution. The point of an institution is not to curry favor with one side versus another. It is not to be acceptable in one way or another. It is for anybody to look at and say, obviously, this is what an education should be, right? To give the students the tools dispassionately to be able to evaluate information that comes to them and decide and create heterodox perspectives, not orthodox perspectives. And I often say that the great measure of a good Minerva education, the things that I strive to create, we've not gotten there yet, it will take us cycles, is that any graduate of a Minerva program should read 100 opinion columns and disagree with 95 of them. Right? They should be able to look and see things that those people who do not have a systematic education simply do not see.
Right.
And
really
no one
informed.
with that.
So tell me a little bit about your outreach to employers. I know you said that you're trying to build this cadre of companies who recognize that the Minerva student is somehow special.
Yeah, we've done a lot of that organically. And even though we only have 1,000 alums so far, actually now with our sister programs, we have about 1,200 alums. So we're starting to get out there, but it's, as you can see from the current student body, that is, we're going to have tens of thousands in a number of years. The impact from employers is dramatic. And I remember the first instance of it was we had a small pilot class, 25 students. They came, studied with us for a year, and then they took a year off, and then they graduated with the first full class. But in that very first summer, one of our first year students applied to and was accepted in an internship at the Santa Fe Institute.
Oh, wow.
The top complexity research center in the world, and was one of, I think 2 freshmen of the 20 interns that they had, most of them juniors from MIT and other places. And he just knocked their socks off. I mean, just like blew them away. And they said, you're incredible. And he said, look, it's not me. I just learned complex systems my freshman year, and I've applied what it is that I've learned, and which they kind of was hard for them to comprehend. And they said, well, we need to bring more Minerva students on board. And he said, well, that's going to be tough because you have a rule at Santa Fe Institute that you only take interns that are US citizens. And 90% of Minerva students are not from the United States. Mm-hmm. So you're going to be competing for a very small sliver of summer interns. And so that summer they changed their rules.
Wow. That's fabulous. That is fabulous.
And that was a story that over the last decade we've seen over and over and over and over again. That was the summer of 2015, exactly 10 years ago, that employers who have seen Minerva students in action just say, yeah, we, by and large, it's not true, of course, of 100% of our graduates, but it's true of the bulk of them, that by and large, these are the kinds of students or graduates with the people who have an education that we can deploy and we want. And that's true, by the way, not just of employers, it's true of investors. The rate of successful entrepreneurship, funded entrepreneurs coming out of Minerva is 20 times that at Stanford. Right? It's true of graduate programs. As far as I know, we still have a better than 50% acceptance rate at Harvard for graduate programs. And so there's the way to change minds and opinions is with proof, right? And that proof is all, and the beauty of it, especially in the students that when we were running the university is now independent, but when I was running the institution and selecting the students, we were selecting students that were, by and large, not from wealthy backgrounds. And so the delta, right? These are not students that spent their times in prep schools and knew they were going to Princeton from 3 weeks before they were born. These were students that came from middle or poor background, middle class or poor backgrounds, by and large, from all over the world, that didn't have the kind of profile that would give them the type of access that they would if they were to have had the kind of profile to get into a Harvard or Stanford, et cetera. Every year we would have maybe 1 or 2 students that would reject Harvard or Stanford and come to Minerva, but most of them were students that wouldn't have been afforded those opportunities. And the fact that as a population, they were able to exceed the outcomes that the majority of students at Ivy League universities have gotten was really the remarkable delta. And it demonstrates the quality and importance of the education.
That's just such an amazing story. Well, this time has just flown, and I don't want to stay past my welcome. So what can people do to help? Where do they go to learn more? What would you like them to do as the next step?
Yeah. So look, there are a number of different ways. This is not an endeavor which will happen overnight. It's been 15 years, and I believe we're just starting. You can learn more at minervaproject.com. That is the hub of all Minerva things across all of our programs. You can advocate for institutions to adopt Minerva programs, whether it be high schools or middle schools, adopting the Minerva Baccalaureate, whether it's universities that are adopting Minerva Project type programs, whether it's employers that want to have professional or executive education that reforms how it is that they think about education and learning and giving their employees or executives the frameworks they need to make better decisions. But more importantly, advocate for the rejection of the status quo. Understand that a schooling system whose job it is to certify but not to educate is not one that we can tolerate as a society anymore. And the more that demand comes up, the more institutions will be required to reform.
I think it's a super important point. I think a lot of faculty would welcome that change in their roles. I mean, there are a bunch that won't, but there are going to be some that really feel they want to have that impact on their students' lives.
Absolutely.
Well, Ben, thank you so much. It's great to reconnect. Keep me in touch if there are things I can do to be helpful, and hopefully this proves elucidating to people who didn't know much about Minerva. So thanks ever so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Rita.